Welcome to Inside Politics Sunday. I'm Abby Phillip, and to our viewers in the United States and around the world, thank you for spending part of your weekend with us. Joe Biden once described himself as a transitional figure for the Democratic Party, but nearly 100 days into his presidency, his record is looking far bigger and bolder. He's facing a deeply divided politically divided nation that was struggling to beat back the deadly COVID pandemic. Biden has had his work cut out for him.
We must end this uncivil war that pits red against blue, shots in arms and money in pockets. That's important. It's not a plan that tinkers around the edges. It's a once-in-a-generation investment in America. I've concluded that it's time to end America's longest war. It's time for American troops to come home. We have to step up. Scientists tell us that this is the decisive decade.
The cover of Bloomberg Businessweek summed up the pace this way: a masked Biden with the title "Move Fast and Fix Things." And the story inside described the even bigger challenges that lie ahead. The president faces a crisis on the southern border, a spike in gun violence, and despite calls for a new era of bipartisanship, there are few signs that Republicans are willing to sign on to his biggest legislative goal, the latest of which is his infrastructure plan. And the Biden administration is now laser focused on the problem of the coronavirus vaccine hesitancy as the rate of shots in arms dips below 3 million a day. In this graphic, you can see that older Americans aged 65 and up are approaching that 75 to 80% marker needed to get to herd immunity, but younger Americans are far off that mark.
To put it simply, if you've been waiting for your turn, wait no longer. Now is the time for everyone over 16 years of age to get vaccinated.
And joining us now to talk about President Biden's tenure as he approaches his first 100 days in office this week is Politico's Laura Barron-Lopez and Lisa Lear of the New York Times. Lisa, President Biden is dealing with obviously a lot of challenges, but we've learned, I think, a lot about where his head is at, where his political compass is at in terms of what he thinks is going to do best for him. He has focused on infrastructure. He's focused on the COVID relief bill. And they say that this is about consensus, but there's that new ABC News Washington Post poll out this morning that gives him some pretty good news, 52% approval rating. But when you look at it in the context of recent presidents, he is only just above former President Trump, who had 42% approval rating at this point in his presidency. And in fact, Joe Biden is third to the bottom of the list of presidents since this poll has been conducted. So is Joe Biden's moral compass really getting him the dividends that he thinks that it should at this point in his presidency?
Well, Abby, one of the big questions of the Trump time was whether President Trump was an aberration, which is something that Joe Biden himself argued a lot during the primary campaign, really a break from decades of what we considered normal in Washington, or if he was a new era. And I think what we see in those numbers is that he did bring in this new era of extreme polarization, and that's what is being reflected in Joe Biden's relatively low approval rating. Republicans and Democrats just have very, very different views on a lot of issues. In fact, a lot of times they believe very different basic facts, which is, a pretty large problem for our democracy. I think the way the Biden administration sees it is that, Democrats believe that their fortunes will rise and fall on two things: needles and checks. So basically, are you getting vaccines into arms, and is the economy recovering? And that's really the focus of a lot of Biden's early efforts, and there's clearly a political reason for that. I've heard from people in the White House that Biden himself, the president, believes that the way to get past some of this polarization is not necessarily by talking about it or sort of having kumbaya moments, but by showing people that government can work for them. So that's part of also what you're seeing, with things like the stimulus funds, with opening up vaccines. I think there's a political goal here and also sort of a larger democracy goal that the White House is trying to achieve, but it's going to be really hard for them.
Yeah. I mean, Laura, what are we learning about what but Biden's priorities have been based on what he's not putting his personal political capital on the line for, namely a couple of things that are big issues, immigration and policing. He's kicked those issues over to Congress. What does that tell us?
Yeah, so I'm going to adopt what kind of historian that I was talking to recently said, which is, and this speaks to Lisa's point, which is that Biden appears to be going more FDR for the first 2 years of his term, which is he's trying to do big social safety net, healthcare expansion, jobs programs, and then he could follow that up potentially with action on immigration, with action on racial justice issues like the George Floyd bill, which would reform policing. And so that appears to be his path right now, which is the primary focus for this administration early on is the pandemic, is the economy. They're right now moving on the infrastructure bill, which is jobs, traditional infrastructure, broadband, followed up by more of a family's plan focused on child tax credit, focused on paid leave. And so those are their big priorities that they are betting that the American public is going to want, that is popular, and that they're hoping will help them stay in the majority in 2022.
We also know, Lisa, that this speech this week that he's going to give for a joint session of Congress is going to actually talk a lot about racial justice issues. And you have a piece this weekend that talks about some of these sky-high promises. Rashad Robinson, the president of Color of Change, told you, I don't want to be classifying this as some sort of out-front radical leadership. That would really not represent everything that could be possible if we leaned in more. So how is all of this rhetoric from Biden on racial justice issues being received versus what he's actually delivering for them?
Well, so one thing the administration has done that we really haven't seen before is they've really infused race into all aspects of their agenda. So that means that race is being taken into account, in racial inequalities and everything to where roads are built, to climate change, to how vaccines are distributed. Now, some racial justice advocates like Rashad would say that's by far not enough. They're pointing to issues like policing, where we really haven't seen the administration roll out some huge plan. Of course, they did during the primary, but since being in office, they've really sort of left that to Congress. And there are some proposals around reforming policing making their way through Congress. Some folks, lawmakers, believe that the Floyd verdict gives those proposals some extra momentum, but as we talked about at the top here, it's really hard to see in this polarized environment things getting through Congress, at least not with a 60-vote margin. So that's part of the reason you see people involved in criminal justice really pushing for Democrats to change the filibuster, which is something Biden has shown some hesitancy to doing.
Yeah. I mean, one of the other big decisions that the Biden administration and Congress needs to make is what do they do about taxes? And they've indicated they're going to increase taxes pretty significantly on wealthy Americans, corporations as well. Tom Donilon, who's a senior advisor to the president, described their mandate this way to The Atlantic. He said, the pandemic has fundamentally changed a lot about the economy. He says, the president believes the country is in a place where it wants to do big things and wants to do transformative things. But at the same time, again, this ABC News Washington Post poll gives us some indication of where the country is at. And Americans are saying, 60% of them are saying, they want Biden to try to win support from Republicans by making major changes to legislation. And just 30% say that they want to try to have these proposals, these bold proposals, though they may be, enacted without major change. So, Laura, I mean, is the Biden administration really reading the room correctly here in terms of what the American people want?
Well, they're placing a bet that the American public, and they've even articulated this pretty explicitly, that the American public is maybe not going to be noticed if they pass massive pieces of legislation that help the American public, if they pass it through reconciliation, which is that process that allows them to pass it without Republicans with a simple majority vote. And so they're betting that if that is the route that they ultimately take and they're not able to get Republicans on board with their big proposals, that as long as it ultimately helps people's paychecks and helps keep them safe, then they're thinking that it'll help them come 2022. But it is a balancing act. And one thing that a number of Democrats have told me is that as they look to increase taxes on those top earners, on people earning more than $400,000, that they are very aware of the attacks that are going to come from Republicans. And they've been telling me that they are worried about the fact that they need to get out ahead of those attacks and make sure that they aren't characterized as taxes raised on all Americans or raised on middle class or lower income earners. And so that's something that they're paying attention to as they head towards the midterms.
And we'll see the Republican rebuttal coming from South Carolina Senator Tim Scott this week. So I think on the Republican side, you're already seeing them positioning themselves to rebut some of the issues of race, but also presenting a kind of new face of the Republican Party. Lisa Lehrer and Laura Barone Lopez, thanks for being here and sharing your insights. And up ahead, what Derek Chauvin's guilty verdict means for the future of policing in America. Michigan Republican Representative Peter Meyer's first weeks in Congress were far from typical. Witnessing an insurrection at the Capitol, hours later voting to certify states' election results, one of the few Republicans to cast that vote. And then less than a month later, the freshman lawmaker voted to impeach the leader of his own party, then President Trump. And days later, he admitted that vote may end his political career.
I want to make sure that we have leaders in office who are focusing on, the fact that we are a nation of laws, not men, and who are putting the interests of the country first rather than their own political careers.
And joining me now is Congressman Peter Meyer. Congressman, thanks for being here. Obviously speaking out about the election lies that led to the January 6th insurrection took some degree of political courage on your part. And you've actually said that you bought a flak jacket after casting that vote. I do wonder, do you feel isolated in the Republican Party given that most of your colleagues didn't join you in most of these pivotal moments that we just described?
Well, thank you for having me on, Abby. I would say my goal is to not be a hypocrite, to be able to call balls and strikes fairly and have a voice that comes across as credible, even if somebody may not have my same beliefs or agree on the political side, but to realize that there are places and people who are trying to do the right thing. I would say that there are plenty others who seek to do that as well, but you look at a lot of the institutional incentives out there, and it can be certainly challenging.
Well, to that point, your colleague, Congresswoman Liz Cheney, was quoted in the New York Times saying, quote, "The GOP cannot become the party of QAnon. We cannot become the party of Holocaust denial. We cannot become the party of white supremacy. We watched in horror all that happened on January 6th. So my question to you, though, is why aren't more party leaders saying what she's saying? And if they don't, is this ultimately where your party is headed, given the voices that are the loudest and that seem to be driving the agenda right now?
Well, I learned in my campaign that the loudest voices are not necessarily the ones who are being listened to. Just because you can shout doesn't mean anyone is opening their ears to what you're saying. So I'm proud of those in my party who are looking to be governing, who are looking to earn that credibility. Because at the end of the day, we're not in control in the House. We lost the presidency in 2020. We lost the Senate in 2021. So we need to get back to a point where we can be offering solutions, where we can be earning the trust of the voter and getting that rare privilege of governing on behalf of the American people.
You make the point about the losses that the Republican Party faced, and yet you see this parade of Republicans and senior leadership heading down to Florida to sort of kiss the ring of former President Trump. Does that concern you at all?
What concerns me is the fidelity to a very powerful and impressive low-dollar fundraising base, and that being pursued at the exclusion of actually being able to, again, win more elections. Now, one of the biggest challenges is if you don't believe that you lost, if you think that the 2020 election was stolen, and then you drag that out and say, well, of course, then the Georgia Senate elections must be stolen too, you just live in a perpetual state of denial. And I know there are plenty who don't deny it, but it's a conundrum, and one that we hope to come out with, again, by rooting in core conservative principles of limited government, of economic freedom, of individual liberty, rather than tending towards the one-size-fits-all, top-down government solutions, especially federal government solutions, that I think are leading us down a scary path.
Okay, to that point, it's been 100 days almost of the Biden administration. Reflect on that. I mean, was it what you expected or hoped to see from a Biden administration?
I will say I was initially optimistic at the opportunity for bipartisan reforms and solutions. That obviously changed a little bit after we lost the Georgia Senate, because remember, it was a very tight margin in the House. The Democrats were expected to pick up a number of seats, and they actually lost just about as many as initial prognosticators thought they were going to gain. But with the loss of the Senate, I think a real revenge politics came in. And though President Biden, in his initial speech on Inauguration Day, said that he wanted to seek bipartisan solutions, that he would be a unifier, most of the unity has been on the left side of the aisle. I think if you're a progressive, you've seen a lot of just wild sums of taxpayer dollars thrown towards or just thrown vaguely in the direction of things that you like. If you were hoping to see some bipartisan consensus, if you were hoping to see governance from the middle, I think you've been sorely disappointed.
I want to ask you specifically about one of the things being hotly debated right now, which is tax increases. The White House is proposing a series of tax hikes on corporations and the wealthy, including increasing the top marginal tax rate to 39.6% and the capital gains rate to 43.4% to pay for this infrastructure bill. These are taxes on people who have a lot of money in this country, and several wealthy Americans and the corporations that they run say that they would support a higher tax rate for improved infrastructure. So if that's the case, if corporations and the wealthy don't mind paying marginally higher taxes, what's wrong with that?
Well, I think as with Amazon arguing for a $15 minimum wage, and also the way that Facebook is very strongly supportive right now of some new internet regulations, you see plenty of corporations who feel comfortable saying so because they know that they can figure out ways around it, that ultimately they can get some credit for being perceived as on the right side of an issue without really having to pay for it. And listen, there are very few folks who will argue that they don't want to see government funds invested well. I mean, this is one of the reasons why President Biden can call just about anything infrastructure and hope to throw that cloak over it for broad approval. But the reality is that if that money is going to be spent efficiently and wisely and intelligently, there's very little argument. I live in Michigan. Our roads are not great. A lot of us spend a lot more on car repair and replacing tires than we would if there were some increased taxes on the gas that we have. So there are ways of having an effective trade-off. But the biggest underlying challenge is if that money isn't spent well, then you're just piling on to the debt. You're just doing more government programs that are not aligned, again, with going towards a better status quo, but are much more focused on $100 billion on this input, $400 billion on that input, without any guarantee we're going to arrive at the place that's been promised.
I want to get quickly to just this issue of voting that you alluded to earlier in the program. At least 47 states have introduced restrictive voting bills this year, including your home state of Michigan. In Arizona, though, former President Trump is cheering on a recount of ballots in Maricopa County, and he's claiming that it'll expose, in his words, large-scale voter fraud in the 2020 election. As a Republican who's spoken out against these conspiracy theories, are you concerned that party officials across the country, and specifically in Arizona, are doubling down on the big lie?
I think one of the biggest challenges is that election integrity is important to everybody, but how you hear it depends very much on where you sit. The idea that Republicans are out to broadly disenfranchise folks is false. The idea that all these elections were stolen is also false. The challenge right now is so many Republican voters want their officials to do something, but when that something is an impossibility, when it is this belief it's going to uncover widespread fraud, that there's been no purgeable jurisdiction where that argument has been made, there's been no credible investigative body that's been able to find that, it's deeply challenging. On the other side, Democrats see voter suppression around every corner. This is one of the real reasons why I am supportive of having a reprisal of the 2001 Ford-Carter commissions or the 2005 Carter-Baker commissions, so we can actually look and have an authoritative, objective view on how we can actually increase participation.
But when
what are the impacts?
When you see what's happening in Arizona, though, do you support what is going on there, that recount that is supposedly supposed to uncover some kind of fraud that we all know did not happen in the 2020 election?
If the recount is done in a credible way and shows that, again, a lot of these concerns are unfounded, I don't have an issue with that. I mean, if the recount is one that manipulates key data points or uses obfuscation or weird terminology to try to say that there's a fire where there's not even any smoke, then it'll just further undermine credibility in our electoral system and in the nonpartisan administrators and a lot of places who run those elections.
All right, we'll be watching what goes on down there. Congressman Peter Meijer, thanks for being with us this morning.
Thank you, Abby.
And coming up next, will this be a watershed moment for a federal police reform bill? We'll hear from Black Lives Matter activist turned Congresswoman Cori Bush. Cori Bush has a lot of things on her resume: activist, nurse, pastor, and a couple of months ago, she added another title, Congresswoman. Her political career began in the streets with the Black Lives Matter movement in Ferguson, Missouri, after the killing of Michael Brown in their shared hometown. Now, her activist roots have prepared her to push for progressive change in Congress, and last week's verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial is a first step.
This verdict is a step. It's a popping of the lock to be able to get to the place where we can open the door and really start to do the work. This was accountability, but it's not yet justice. Justice for us is saving lives.
We sat down with the Congresswoman on Friday to talk about the verdict, police reform, and President Biden's first 100 days in office. You became an activist because of Michael Brown, who was killed just blocks from where you grew up in Ferguson. And you were running for office when George Floyd was killed, and now Derek Chauvin has been convicted. What does that mean to you as an activist and for, the broader movement that you are a part of?
So many people just from around the country said so many things about us, when we were a part of the Ferguson uprising. And we would hear, go get a job. And, people would tell us that we weren't making change, that change wouldn't happen from people just protesting in the streets. Now, 6.5 years later, to see that the protest didn't stop, that we continued around the country and other parts of the world, continue to protest and to speak up and speak out against police violence that disproportionately affect our communities. To see this officer receive the accountability that he needed to receive, it was incredible to see, but it's also sad that it was incredible to see.
Well, tell us about this moment between you and Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley when you heard the Chauvin verdict come down.
We just grabbed each other because, it was just like, if nobody else feels what we're feeling right now, for the two of us to be both young women in Congress, both young Black women in Congress, and both young women who are activists in our own ways in Congress, there was that piece between the two of us, because both of us have been in the fight for Black lives, and we needed one another in that moment.
And for so many people, this has been an incredibly emotional week. The question I think Congress is facing right now is, would you accept a qualified immunity alternative that would hold police departments accountable if it means getting the George Floyd police reform bill through Congress, even if it's not 100% of what you initially wanted?
You know, right now we need to end qualified immunity, period. You know, that's my stance. So
you are not willing to compromise on that?
So we compromise on so much, you know, we compromise, we die. We compromise, we die. We compromise, we die. You know, I didn't come to Congress to compromise on what could keep us alive, because it holds police officers specifically accountable. Because the thing is this: if you don't hurt people, if you don't kill people, if you are just and fair in your work, then do you need the qualified immunity anyway? You know, so the thing is, all of this safety net. The safety net shouldn't be there. But let me say this: where are all of these special protections for nurses and for other people in other positions that do very dangerous work, that's just trying to help people? So no, I will not compromise on that. We need to end qualified immunity, and the reason why there is this open lane for compromise is because they see that people will do it. I didn't come. St. Louis did not send me here. St. Louis being number one for police murder in the country per capita, and has been that way for years. The people did not send me here to save their lives by falling down on the one thing that we needed the most. No.
And I don't want to belabor this, and I hear the passion in your voice on this issue, but if it comes back to the House with a compromise on qualified immunity, would you vote against that?
I'm not prepared to vote. I'm not prepared to support that.
President Biden this week will mark his 100th day in office, and a lot of progressives like you were really critical of him as a candidate. You were an early supporter of Bernie Sanders, but when you look at what he has been able to do in office so far, would you say that he's progressive enough for you?
You know, I guess the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about President Biden's first 100 days in office is the American Rescue Plan. Like, that is the first thing that that just, comes to me. And that is a truly progressive, and it's bold, that package. So I have to give credit for that, but our work is not done, so we're going to continue to work with the Biden administration. We're going to continue to talk to the White House, because we want to see direct cash payments. We want to see those into our communities. We need to see that. The conversation isn't done. We need to prioritize raising the minimum wage to at least $15.
In the Senate, Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia has essentially, used what seems to be a veto power against a lot of progressive priorities, including some of the ones that you've mentioned. But in the House, Democrats have this 2-seat majority. There are 6 members of the squad, of which you are a part. What's stopping you from flexing that same power for your agenda? You just said you would vote against a compromise on qualified immunity. Are you prepared, and the rest of the squad prepared, to use that kind of veto power that you have if you vote as a bloc?
I'm prepared to do whatever is needed to make sure that that our agenda moves forward. But I can't speak for the rest of the squad members. At the end of the day, my sister Ayanna Presley says it all the time: you vote alone, and you're voting for your districts. So you're voting for the people who voted you in. You're voting their needs and their values.
Your first real day as a member of Congress was January 6th. What are your, here are your thoughts on Twitter 2 days after you said, expel the Republican members of Congress who incited the white supremacist attempted coup. You can't miss that we live in this country where you were elected, but so were Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert. What does that tell you about the America that we're living in 2021?
We all know, and maybe some people just don't want to acknowledge it, but racism never left. It didn't go anywhere. It was just I believe that people felt emboldened, empowered by a president in our former President Donald Trump, to be able to express their views publicly about and those views that are white supremacist views. People will get to see the actual work that comes from the people that if they're bringing home what needs to be brought home to their communities, if they're actually doing the work, if they're actually helping people, if they're saving lives, if they're changing the lives of their people for the better. But not all of this rhetoric that has to do with me being Anglo-Saxon and great, all of that foolishness. No, are people eating now because of your work? Do people have shelter now because of your work? Do people have housing? Do people have health care and all of those things that they need because of your direct work, or nah? Or nah? Is it just that they just get to hear you and they see that you fundraise? That's what it is. Let's be real. Well, it's to fundraise.
Congresswoman Cori Bush, a few months under your belt. You've got many, many more to go. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Have a great one.
And coming up next, a 51st state. The D.C. statehood debate is back in the headlines and at the top of the Democratic agenda. Lawmakers are once again debating legislation to make Washington, D.C. the 51st state. The argument in favor of statehood is familiar. Democrats say D.C. residents pay federal taxes and should get representation and voting rights in Congress. On Thursday, the Democrat-led House passed statehood legislation narrowly with President Biden's support. But what's new are some of the arguments on the Republican side against statehood. Republicans say making the capital city a state violates the Constitution, but in recent weeks, other GOP members and their supporters have made all kinds of other arguments against statehood, like DC's crime is too high, or that residents here influence Congress through yard signs and don't need a vote at all, or that not enough people live here for it to qualify for statehood, even though DC's estimated 2019 population was larger than Vermont's and Wyoming's population, both of which have congressional representation in both the House and the Senate. But mostly the debate boils down to this. Who would get more power in Washington if the heavily Democratic-leaning district becomes a state?
To make the District of Columbia a state, that'd give them 2 new Democratic senators.
And of course, this measure has an uphill climb facing it. It needs to clear a 60-vote threshold in the Senate in order to pass, and several Democrats in the Senate, like Joe Manchin, aren't committed at all. But at least now the arguments are all out in the open. This, like many things in Washington, comes down to power, with D.C. residents still hanging in the balance. And that's it for Inside Politics Sunday. Join us back here every Sunday at 8 a.m. Eastern Time, and the weekday show as well at noon Eastern. But coming up next, State of the Union with Jake Tapper and Dana Bash. And Dana's guests include the Vice President, Kamala Harris, and Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. Thank you again for sharing your Sunday morning with us. Have a great rest of your day.
Inside Politics Sunday.